Let us know the Bible, the Old Testament. With Father Claudio Doglio. Genesis, an introduction. Genesis is the first book of the Bible. It is the first book of the Pentateuch. It is the work that introduces the whole Bible. Its title in Greek is Genese. It says that it is about the origin. It is the narration that introduces the great story of the people of Israel. With the Exodus begins the fundamental event that gives birth to Israel as a people. Genesis is the antecedent, the history of the ancestors, and tells the intervention of God that who prepares the decisive moment of liberation of the covenant with Israel. The book of Genesis, like the rest of the Pentateuch, was born through a long history of tradition that lasted many centuries. But once the final text has already been established, it is important to give weight to the last author, the final editor, who collected all these ancient traditions, gave it homogeneous form to all the material. And so, although often scholars who follow the historical critical method want to excavate and to reconstruct what was before, it is considered more appropriate to read the text carefully as it exists in its first phase, last phase. It is important to recognize that the finished text we read today in the Bible is more important than any hypothetical reconstructions. Furthermore, we should not give too much weight to historical reconstructions of these events because the fundamental intention is theological. These stories are not made to instruct us in the history of ancient events, but to educate the reader. In the Jewish tradition, Genesis and the other books of the Pentateuch are called Torah. These stories are designed to be formative, to educate, to transmit a knowledge of God. Therefore, the theological sense is more important than the historical sense or the reconstruction of the facts. And as a reader, that we know how to interpret the text, we recognize that symbolic spiritual meaning and that is more important than the literal meaning. We are not reading a chronicle of ancient events. We are listening to a teaching, a theological instructions for our lives. So Genesis is not a book of information about antiquity, but a book that instructs the believer who adheres to the Lord God. It shows how God worked in human history. The book of Genesis is quite big. It is divided into 50 chapters, but we can structure it into three main parts, following three different literary genres. The first part comprises chapter 1 to 11. They are clearly distinguished from the rest of the book because in these 11 chapters, it does not talk about Israel, of Israel's ancestors, but of humanity in general. It is a universal discourse. The language used in these 11 chapters is mostly mythical. That is, it uses myth as in ancient cultures, they were all doing that. The myth is not something bad, something negative or anti-religious. We cannot trivialize it by saying that myth is an invention, a fable. No, myth is a very instrumental religious tool that ancient humanity used to explain their own vision of the world. Myth is a true philosophical tool. It is a help to help people to understand how the world is interpreted and to understand the meaning of life. The first 11 chapters of Genesis contain meta-historical etiologies, a difficult word that I have used on purpose to introduce it in our language. It is an etiology. It is a word that doctors use when they are looking for the cause of something. It is called etiology, the search for the cause. When we are faced with certain realities in the world, in history of human relations, we seek the primary cause, the arhe, the principle, the original element that determined the current situation. This etiology is qualified as meta-historical. It is an expression coined by a great German theologian, Karl Rahner, to indicate something that goes beyond history, not within history, but beyond history. The first 11 chapters of Genesis contain mythical accounts to explain the causes beyond history that determine the consequence, the many consequences in history. There are negative situations. There is evil in the world. Where does the evil come from? Why are the relationships between people not so clear and correct? But often there are bad relationships that make people suffer. And why suffering? Pain, death. Why sin? Where do all these things come from? The ancient myth tellers explain the origin of these realities by attributing the blame to the gods. The book of Genesis says instead that the cause of all this negative situation, it is attributed to the responsibility of man. Thus, at the beginning, it is shown God's wonderful creation, where he insistently says, God saw that it was good. And in the end, after creating man and woman, God saw that it was very good, very beautiful, all harmonious, perfect. Perfectly beautiful, yes, but we no longer see this harmony of perfect beauty. We realize that there are things that are wrong. Here is the second page that adds man's responsibility to God's great gift. People have responded with an attitude of disobedience, of rebellion, an act of pride that has set them against God in the claim of being autonomous and self-sufficient. In the distrust of God, man has ruined harmony, has broken the relationship between humanity and God, between people themselves, and has broken the relationship between man and created realities. And this situation is what we experience. The first 11 chapters of Genesis narrate the creation of the world and man, the original rebellion of man and woman who, by an act of pride, lose their friendship with God and are expelled from the garden. And this humanity begins to produce evil. The first two brothers hate each other, and one kills the other. And things get worse to the point of total destructions. Seemingly, a total failure of the creation. The deluge is the return to chaos. But in this mythical event of the flood, God offers His grace to one man, thanks to whom the whole world is saved and has a new lease on life. God makes a covenant with Noah, but things have not changed because Noah's children produce evil once again. A son despises his father and his descendants are proud, trying to establish a tyrannical dictatorship with a tower that reaches up to the sky. The first 11 chapters of Genesis contain a meta-historical theology with mythical language. Let us not say that the myth is not true. The myth is not historical, but it is true. It communicates a truth. These Bible stories contain a truth about God in mythical language. What is the difference between a mythical text and a historical text? A historical event has happened once and only once. The historical fact is unrepeatable. Instead, the mythical fact always happens. We must be careful because there is a tendency to say that if the story is mythical, the event did not happen. To say that it's not happened just once means that it always happens. It happens to everyone. It happens everywhere. Therefore, it is something much, much more certain and important than a historical episode that happened only once. These stories instead want to offer a wise interpretation of all history, mine and yours, here and now, although they narrate events that occurred many, many centuries ago. The first part of the book of Genesis are chapters 1 to 11. The second part, chapters 12 to 36, contain the stories of the ancestors, the events of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These texts belong to another literary genre. They are no longer mythical texts. They are familiar legends. Here again, we are not dealing with historical narratives. These are episodes that are lost in the fog of time and were retold many centuries after these events occurred and were told in a legendary way with enrichment, with theological intentions. They are family stories, are popular narratives, they are religious teachings. The one who tells the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob does not intend to write a history book like telling the story of Julius Caesar's life, but tells in such a way that instructs the faithful on God's style and on the right or wrong style that people can have towards God. Not everything the patriarchs did is good. We should not start from the idea that in the Bible we can find an anthology of beautiful examples. Some people have this strange idea, as if it were a life of saints. When the Bible is read for good examples and everything's written there is a moral example to imitate. If you read the Bible this way, it is a disaster. It is not the fault of the Bible, but of the reader who is a fool. These stories are not intended to present positive moral images to be imitated, but theologically tell stories that teach good and evil, positive and negative attitudes. Abraham is the man of faith to the extent he trusts in God. Abraham is a model, but not in everything. There are episodes where he tries to adjust, he tries to find human solutions to his problem of not having a child. And those episodes are not examples to follow. Abraham is wrong even when he tries to solve the problems with his head. But when he trusts in God, he realizes that the promise is kept. God has promised himself and keeps his word. A child is born to the old father finally, and his mouth opens to smile, and he called the child Smile, Isaac. And the story of Abraham's sacrifice is another great image of teaching about faith, showing how the father has the courage to go against himself to be faithful. But the story serves to say that human sacrifices should not be made. It is not what God wants. 2 sons are born to Isaac, Esau and Jacob. These are the names of 2 peoples. Jacob is Israel, Esau is Edom. They are 2 brotherly peoples who fight among themselves, have different mentalities, and have always fought each other. The history of the people who occupied the land of Canaan is reproduced in these ancient family sagas of the ancestors. And thus Jacob had 12 sons, the founders of the 12 tribes, and are the names of the various groups that formed Israel. It is said that Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and that each had a servant. And Jacob had children by these 4 women. Do you want to get a moral lesson out of this? Do you want to learn how to do this? This is not the intention of the narrative. Leah means cow, and Rachel means sheep. The tribes are divided into the children of the Leah and Rachel's sons. The sons of the cow are cattle breeders. The sons of the sheep are sheep breeders, farmers, and those who raise sheep have different mentalities and attitudes. Not only that, but they are also the spouse's children and the maid's children. There are first-rate and second-rate tribes, those who command and those who serve, those who take a greater percentage and those who are satisfied with the crumbs. These are very old stories that are reproduced in these family legends, and the final narrator has given them a beautiful theological homogeneity. It narrates everything to teach God's style. The third part of the book of Genesis is the sapiential tale of Joseph from chapter 37 to 50. It is the story of a person and his family. He is a man who realizes his own life. He is a wise man who, in spite of his misfortune, manages to raise and save his family. It is a story of a divided family, of brothers who fight among themselves, of children who are angry with the father. And in the end, the story shows a transformation of that family. It is the story that explains how God guides history. Even though wrong actions, God builds a history of salvation. The brothers hate Joseph. They sell him into slavery in Egypt. They take him away from them. Joseph, sold in Egypt, makes a career, becomes minister of agriculture, and has grain to sell to the hungry brothers. He educates them, forms them, but saves them, and in the end, he will be able to say, God has sent me before you to save your lives. And so, the story of the ancestors comes to Egypt. Israel went down to Egypt with all his children and settled there. The book of Genesis narrates the preview of Exodus. Turning the page, finishing Genesis, begins the second book set in Egypt, and it is the strong weight of the Pentateuch.